Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Joe Lopez, Vice President of Marketing and Communications for the Richard Nixon Foundation, and it's my honor to kick off tonight's event. We are privileged to have two distinguished guests with us this evening, Jack Carr and James Scott, to discuss their incredible new book, Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine Barracks bombing and the untold origin story of the War on Terror. Jack Carr, from a young age, Jack Carr had two dreams: serving his country as a Navy SEAL and becoming an author. Following 20 years in the SEAL teams, Jack shifted his sights to publishing and fulfilled his literary objective with the release of his debut novel, The Terminal List, which became a #1 series on Amazon Prime. Since then, he has written many bestsellers, and tonight he will talk about his first nonfiction book, Targeted Beirut. Jack's co-author of Targeted Beirut is James Scott, an acclaimed historian, Pulitzer Prize Finalist, and author of works on pivotal events in military history. James is a scholar in residence at the Citadel. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jack Carr and James Scott.
Guys.
Please remain standing. Please remain standing as we honor our country with the presentation of colors and the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you. You may be seated. Thank you to the Troy High School Navy JROTC for the presentation of the colors, and Ali Solorio for that beautiful rendition of our national anthem. Tonight, Jack Carr and James Scott will have a discussion on stage, and then they're going to take your questions. So please, you got about 30 minutes to get your questions ready for Q&A. I want to see a lot of hands up, and one of our team members will come find you with the microphone so you can ask your question. After tonight's program, Jack and James are going to be in the front entrance where they want to say hello to each of you, and I hope that you pick up a signed copy of Targeted Beirut in the gift shop on your way out. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Jack and James. Thank you.
Here we go. Hi. Hi. Here we go. All right. Well, here we are.
Yeah.
This is awesome. Who's moderating this thing?
Yeah.
Just kidding. Just kidding. Thank you guys so much for being here tonight. I sincerely appreciate everybody taking the time. And who's toured this museum before? I mean, incredible. That is so amazing. What a special spot this is. Learned so much walking through here earlier today. So thank you to everybody who supports the foundation and this presidential library. Sincerely appreciate it. Gosh, you know what? I love, so when we sing the national anthem like that and do all that, who here was in the military and went to base movie theaters? And before, yeah, so isn't that cool? Do they still play the national anthem before movies? Does anyone know, do they? I love that. I always told myself in the military that one day I might buy a movie theater and just play 80s action movies, but before each one, you know, do that. So everybody has to stand up and do that. I think that'd be awesome. It's still on my list. Actually, let's write that down. Yeah, forgot about that. And anybody in here, military, former military, law enforcement, first responders, firefighters, and then spouses of all of those.
Yeah.
All of those, yeah. And well, thank you guys all so much. And yeah, big hand to everybody that steps up like that. Yeah. And Trish and Britt, thank you guys for being here. Stacy, thank you for being here. And David, Ashley, thank you guys so much as well. All right, so we're gonna kick this thing off.
Let's do it.
And I think probably the best way to start is like how we got to be here.
Yeah.
And so a little background on the nonfiction side of the house. Who here is familiar with the thrillers? They've read the thrillers or watched the TV show with Pratt and all that, awesome. So if you've read the books, then you know that I weave a lot of history into the pages of those thrillers. If you follow me on social media, you know I like to commemorate different events, particularly terrorist events, on their anniversaries, so we don't forget that they happened, and then maybe draw a couple of those lessons, either strategic, operational, or tactical from them. So I always knew that I'd branch off into the nonfiction space. And anybody who read Clancy growing up knows that he started, actually yesterday was the publication date of The Hunt for Red October back in 1984. And then he went to Red Storm Rising and Patriot Games and Cardinal of the Kremlin and Clear and Present Danger. And then in the early 90s, he branches out and starts doing nonfiction. You might remember Submarine was his first one. One series was called A Guided Tour. The other one was called A Study in Command. So he started to diversify in the early 90s. Also with video games, of course, he had the movies and all the rest of it. So I always knew that I would do that, and when I thought that I had built up enough political capital through the thrillers with Simon & Schuster, I figured it was time to ask them if they'd be interested in doing a nonfiction series. So pitched it to them, and as part of that, I wanted to capture those strategic, operational, tactical lessons learned and also humanize different events. And at the start, I wrote down probably 3 pages worth of different terrorist events from the end of World War II up to 3 years ago when I first discussed it with Simon & Schuster. And I kept coming back to Beirut, 1983, as the pivotal moment in our relationship with the Middle East as far as modern history goes. So I kept coming back to that. And although there were terrorist events before 1983 and after, really Beirut 1983, specifically October 23rd, is the date that set the rules for everything that was to come. And those rules were really set by Iran through proxies. And so the model, the paradigm that we've been relating to Iran with ever since really was established back in October of 1983. But at the same time, I told them that I want to work with someone on this, because this is a big responsibility, especially when you're telling a story that, with people who were blown off their feet by this explosion and ran to the sound of that explosion and started digging through the rubble for their buddies with their bare hands, K-bar knives, maybe a shovel, maybe a crowbar if they could find it. And you're going to be interviewing family members who lost loved ones that day and who've had an empty seat at that dinner table ever since. So I wanted to work with someone who knew what they were doing, and I told them there's only one person I wanted to work with, and that was James Scott. And I was a huge fan of his work. He has 4 books on World War II, 1 on the USS Liberty, and they're all just fantastic. So if you don't have them in your library, please add them to your library tonight. Everybody take out your phone. Just kidding. But
you can
do
just
it right
go on
after.
Amazon right now. So.
Just do it. You can do it. You can do it right after. But it sounds crazy though about today, because you can find so much out about somebody just by going on YouTube or whatever. But I didn't do any of that. I just loved the work. And it sounds strange now that I didn't even go watch one interview with you just to make sure you weren't a crazy person or something.
Jury's still out.
Yeah, I'm still debating. So I just loved the work, and I told them I wanted to work with James Scott, and they said, well, I was talking to my agent and publisher editor, and they said, well, who's his agent? And so I had your books right there, so I went to the acknowledgments or author's note, and I said, well, he's thanking some guy named John Glussman. And my editor and publisher, Emily Bessler of Emily Bessler Books, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster, she said, John Glussman, that's my husband. And I thought, this is very convenient for me. And so they put us in contact, and we hit it off right away. And James was working on another book, which got put on hold for a bit, and that's on the 3 days between Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. And had to put that on hold, which John Glussman very wisely, being married to Emily, decided that was a prudent course of action to put that on hold and do this. But in that first conversation that we had, what were your thoughts when we first called and got put in contact?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jack. And I'll tell you, it's funny because, as he noted, my editor at W.W. Norton is actually the spouse of our editor for this project at Simon & Schuster. And so when it was all kind of coming together, it was during the tail end of the pandemic, and a lot of people were working remotely at home. And so I was actually talking to my editor on the phone. And he was at home with his wife, and so he's like, hang on, if I'm gonna have this conversation, I need to step outside so she can't hear it. And so he steps outside the backyard and he says, James, whatever you do, don't screw this up. And so, his domestic harmony was dependent upon this partnership working out there. And of course, it's been awesome. And as you guys can imagine, when Jack Carr reaches out to you, I was a huge fan of The Terminal List, the TV show. I started reading the books after that. Just like many of you out there, I was blown away by it all. And so when Jack Carr calls you up and says, I want to work on a project with you, you say, absolutely. And off to the races we went. And I'll tell you, it's interesting because right when Jack had reached out, of course, he had the idea for Beirut. And right when he reached out, I was literally going to a conference, a World War II conference of all places. And one of the gentlemen who was there is a good friend of mine from, worked at the Citadel at one point, but he was more recently had been the director of Marine Corps history, a guy by the name of Charlie Niemeyer. And we were at dinner one night, and I said, Charlie, I've been sort of approached about this idea of doing a book looking at the 1983 Marine headquarters and barracks bombing. As former director of Marine Corps history, what kind of materials do you have? Do you have the documentation and the sources that we would need for this? And he said, we have it all. He says, we have the monthly command chronologies, the weekly sit-rep reports, the daily message traffic. He said the Marines even did an oral history project in 82 and 83, right around the time of the bombing, including interviewing some of these guys right after the bombing. And he said, more importantly, you guys need to do this story. It needs to be told. And so that same exact weekend I was at that conference, I remembered a buddy of mine from the Citadel, who I'd done my master's there during a couple of our classes, he'd brought up his time in Beirut. And, I couldn't remember the details of it specifically because he just sort of mentioned it in passing. So I texted him, I said, Mark, you had some connection to Beirut and whatnot. Remind me what that was. And he said, I was one of the rescuers when that bomb went off. And so as I'm running between like the A gates and the B terminal or whatever, I called him up and I was like, you got to tell me what's going on here. And he relayed his story to me. And I mentioned to Mark, I said, looking at this project on that. And he said, exact same thing Charlie did. You guys need to do this project. I can put you in touch with all the guys that I was there with. And so literally, right from the get-go, Jack and I were just seeing green lights, green lights, green lights. The documentation's there, the ability to interview folks who were there. And then also, when we did a review of the literature at that time period, we realized there had been nothing really done on this bombing, which was extraordinary. been a book done in 1984 by a journalist at the time and military historian. Of course, he didn't have access to a lot of the classified materials that have since become available. He didn't have access to a lot of the guys who didn't want to talk about it, were still on active duty and things like that. But for the last 4 decades since then, there's nothing. And so it really was, I think, just, it all came together perfectly for the right time, the right access to the materials, and of course, with the current events these days.
And maybe add a little bit of analysis, and then just like, we're
Basically neighbors here to the Nixon Library, right? So they're phenomenal. They've got finding aids, a wonderful reading will be available. They're like, yeah, we're gonna have to get somebody from maintenance and some WD-40 up here and see if we can't get that thing opened up. But they were phenomenal to work with. It's just, it wasn't quite the well-oiled machine that you might find at a National Archives facility like right here at the Nixon Library or up the road at the Reagan Library, so.
Yeah. And when we started, we also knew we wanted to start with April 1983, the embassy bombing, and then work our way to October 23rd, and then analyze what happens in the aftermath of the actual event. And as someone who's a student of history and who's fairly in tune with these different terrorist events, particularly during the 80s, 90s, and up through today, I was well aware of April 1983, well aware of October 1983, but what I wasn't so aware of was what happened between those dates and between those attacks. And I was aware that we lost servicemen during that time frame, but I wasn't really sure what happened during that spring, summer, into the fall, because back then, of course, there's no real independent media, there's no new media, there's no social media, and talking points for the administration keep calling these Marines peacekeepers. That's something you heard over and over again, peacekeepers, peacekeepers, and I just didn't know what happened in there. And was that a surprise to you too, or did you know what happened in that spring, summer, and into that early fall?
No, a lot of that was new to me as well. And you got to remember, because Jack and I are really close in age. So we were in grade school when this happened. So for us, it was, we remember when it happened, but kind of digging into it and learning about it. And, for folks, who may recall that time better than we did when we first started out, Beirut was a mess at that point. And the reason that the United States was sent in there was because, Lebanon had come out of literally a really long civil war that had begun in the 1970s, and here we are in the early 1980s, and it's essentially a sectarian fight. You've got the Christians, you've got the Sunnis, you've got the Shias. They're having an internal power struggle that really has gone on despite their civil war, really all the way back to their foundation after the end of World War II. On top of this, you had the PLO had come out of Jordan and set up shop in there. They were using Beirut to attack the Israelis. The Israelis were then responding and bombing into Beirut. Of course, Syria wanted a big chunk of Lebanon for itself. And of course, on top of all this, the Iranians, who are looking to spread their revolution, see an opportunity to capitalize on this chaos by sending in Iranian revolutionary guardsmen to set up a terrorist training camps. And so from the get-go, you see what kind of just total mess you're dealing with in Lebanon. And that, of course, is the backdrop in which we send in the United States Marines to try to provide a stabilizing force, show the flag, to make patrols, help create a sense of calm so that Lebanon can once again get back up on its feet. And of course, as 1982, when they're first sent in, rolls into 1983, those internal rivalries and battles start to heat back up again, and our Marines who are sitting on the sideline of this fight increasingly are getting pulled into this conflict. And this bullseye soon lands on their back there. And of course, you see that with the embassy bombing in April of 1983. Of course, that is a Hezbollah orchestrated attack. Hezbollah is a homegrown terrorism group that is supported by Iran at that point. Of course, it begins with just a handful of recruits in the Bekaa Valley, and it's now going to grow over decades later to be this dominant political party. But the seeds of it really begin there in April with the attack on the embassy. That, of course, is going to pale in comparison to the attack 188 days later when they come for the Marines at 6:21 a.m. on a Sunday morning.
And the Marines, of course, are trained to go in, crush the enemy, and come home. And now we're putting them into this position as peacekeepers, something for which they're not trained, putting them into a tactically disadvantageous, untenable position. What surprised you in doing this research about why they were sent, or was it a surprise that the Marines would be sent in as peacekeepers? And do you feel that, like I do, that there is an imperial hubris type of a mindset attached to a lot of the decisions that we made back then and continue to make today?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think that really gets at the heart of this whole situation, because as anybody who knows the Marines know that these guys are an amphibious assault force. You know, they're used to storming a beach, going in there, you know, and getting the job done and then heading back out aboard ship. One thing Marines are not really good at is just riding around and showing the flag. That is just not what they are designed to do. But the fact that we send those Marines in reflects sort of this disconnect that was going on at that time inside the Reagan administration. It's really more than a disconnect, it's an internal battle, because the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Defense Department don't want the Americans in Lebanon. They think that, you know, look, this is a distraction from the larger fight here, which is the Cold War, our standoff with the Russians. You know, we also know that the Syrians are, of course, a proxy of the Soviet Union, and putting American troops there in access to Syria, and as well as in the internal fights, it's just a recipe for us to get pulled more into this violence. So the Defense Department and the Joint Chiefs don't want to do it. So their idea is like, we're just going to send in a few troops just for a very limited time. We're going to have them out by Christmas of 1982. Of course, that doesn't happen. The flip side is that the State Department and the National Security Council, particularly Bud McFarlane, who's National Security Advisor, they see an opportunity for nation building in Lebanon.
Sounds familiar.
It does. And when they're not getting the success they want at the negotiating table, they start putting pressure on the Marines. You know, they want to be able to wield that U.S. hammer to be able to help make up for their failures at the negotiating table. And through the increasing mission creep of the Marines, they get pulled into this sectarian domestic battle that's going on in Lebanon. And of course, that bullseye just gets bigger and bigger and bigger on their back.
Yeah, they're really the symbol of American might, and therefore become the target.
And there are only 1,800 of them. And that's the thing you got to remember. This is a tiny, tiny force thrown into the middle of a civil war.
Yeah. And between April and October, let's set the stage a little bit as we work our way towards October 23rd. But Thomas Friedman, very interesting, living over there. David Ignatius over there as well. So we have journalists there at a very famous hotel that sounds like that we should write a book about it at some point, filled with spies and journalists. It sounds like a really good time, actually.
That could be. I mean, I'm hearing follow-up stories. You know, at least fiction-wise. I think you could definitely use it.
Yeah. No, I think so. And car bombs were something that I learned a little bit about during the course of this research as well. And that, of course, we have a suicide bombing with a vehicle in April. One had been done before, so it wasn't brand new, but it was still fairly new to the United States.
Yeah.
And of course, we'll see even larger bomb in October. But there was a whole cottage industry, which I didn't realize, of car bomb diffusers in Lebanon, because there was such a prominent thing, not with someone in the vehicle driving it into something, but just parked along the side of the road and then detonated like that. So there was this whole industry there. Yeah. And there's one guy who was considered, I think, the best of the car bomb diffusers, but he wasn't that great because he was missing a couple fingers.
Yeah, he only had 8 fingers. So I guess, you know, I don't know what their workers' comp was like.
I'm thinking
if he got any kind of coverage there.
I'm thinking it wasn't robust. But take us through that spring, summer, into the early fall, and what changes as far as the mission goes without that mission is changing, as Colonel Garrity will tell us.
Absolutely. So, you know, the Americans arrive, the Marines arrive in May of 1983, and they're coming in, as Jack just noted, right on the wake of the bombing of the U.S. Embassy. And of course, the bombing of the embassy is the first time that the terrorists have used basically a vehicle-borne IED. It's a suicide bomber. Drives right into the front of the embassy. We had no real protection out front, a few sawhorses, that was about it. None of the kind of protection you see out front of our embassies these days. Of course, the bomb goes off, it collapses the front of the embassy, kills 63 people, including 17 Americans. But as Jack so colorfully noted, you know, car bombs were the reality in Lebanon. I mean, they were going off all the time. And even Tom Friedman wrote about it and said, you know, he got bored covering them as a reporter. And he would find that he would go to a car bombing scene, and instead of like interviewing people, he'd be looking at the destruction thinking, you know, that chicken that's been blown out of that store window, it still smells really good. Or those broken bottles of Johnny Walker, you know, it was just, that's how common they were. And so when that bomb goes off, nobody really sees it yet for what it is. You know, they think it's, yes, it's different than our typical car bombs. I mean, it's a driver and not a parked vehicle, but they don't recognize it amid the chaos of Beirut as a foreshadowing of the horror that's about to come. And so that missed opportunity there, that sort of it escapes us.
Yeah, let's talk about Dr. John Hudson for a moment before we get to October. And part of this book, when I first pitched it to Simon & Schuster, humanizing the event was an important part of it, but what really happened during the course of this research and writing was that it became the most important part of it, if that makes sense. Yes, we capture those lessons, but what really brings it all home is capturing the stories of the people who were there and the family members who were at home. And Dr. John Hudson is somebody who essentially becomes the emotional heart of this story. And we were lucky enough to have 600 pages of letters, voice recordings. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how you got to know John Hudson. And we both feel like we know him personally now. We know his widow, we know his son, who never met his dad. So can you talk a little bit about that, how that all came about?
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, really, one of the great things about this experience for us was the connections we got to make with so many of the Beirut veterans and their families. We did over 100 hours of interviews with survivors, with widows, with the children, with even the parents in some cases of the men who were there, and many of whom were killed there. And one of our favorites was Dr. John Hudson. And he was the Navy doctor. You know, the Marines don't actually have their own medical. They depend on the Navy for their medicine. And so he was the doctor there. And he was a voracious letter writer. And in our business, I love letter writers. I love pack rats, those people who keep documents. And so he wrote letters every single day. And his widow gave us 641 pages of his letters. And 9 hours of cassette recordings. Who remembers the Sony Walkman, right? Okay, well, back in the cassette tape era, a lot of these guys would make recordings. They'd mail the cassette tapes home, and she still had 9 hours of recordings of his. And so had them digitally turned over so we could listen to him today, digital format. And so we were able to hear his voice. And you could hear the machinery in the background of what was going on in Beirut and things like that. And so even though he was killed there, we really got to know him. And got to read and got to understand his hopes for the future. He had a 9-month-old son. He wanted to go back to Milledgeville, Georgia, and be a country doctor when all this was over. He realized he'd made a terrible mistake going into the military because he wanted to pay off his student loans, and he never realized he could end up in Lebanon. And but he was just this awesome guy. Everybody loved him. He was the Hawkeye from MASH, is how everybody described him. And but he also, because he's a little bit older and whatnot, he had this foreshadowing that things were going to turn out badly. And he made this decision that I'm going to have to expand my medical team. I'm the only doctor on the beach, and so I'm going to bring in the 2 dentists that we have here. I'm going to make them freshen up on their triage and their mass casualty plans and whatnot, because he had a bad feeling they might be needed.
Yeah, for those who are in the military, you know that doctors are a little bit of a different breed. They might not wear their uniform quite right because they only go to a couple-week little school to learn the fork and knife stuff, and you're not really concerned if their gig line's a little bit off or whatever. You just want them to be a good doctor or maybe do a good root canal or something like that. So he had no incentive to toe the party line, and so these letters are very, very honest, and so you really get a sense of what's happening there on the ground through him, and we're fortunate that that Lisa shared those all with us. And before we get to October, also, what's going on in the White House during this time, and who is advocating to put Marines ashore? Who is recommending we keep them offshore? What's going on at that executive level at this time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what is happening is, as things are heating up on the ground, as the Marines are getting pulled more and more into combat, they're starting to become targets. And artillery rounds are landing there in their compound. Snipers start going for them. 6 Marines are killed in the summer of 1983 before the bomb ever even goes off. And there's a disconnect of what's going on in Washington at this point, because events are moving very quickly on the ground in Lebanon. But by the time it gets back to Washington, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 miles away, the bureaucracy slows things down. And so the ability to react quickly on the ground isn't there. And as the situation's heating up, of course, this tug of war inside the administration over whether we should pull the Marines out or engage them even more is really playing out. And of course, the commander of the Marines, a guy by the name of Colonel Timothy Garrity, really a tremendous individual, had this great comment. He said, you know, the situation changed in Beirut, but no one changed the situation. And I think that really captured it well as the Marines are getting pulled more and more and more into harm's way. You know, their mission, their rules of engagement aren't changing. Their mission hasn't been changed, of course, because all of that is playing out in Washington, where that tug of war has created a paralysis to prevent any kind of real change that could either pull them out or better equip them for the environment that they're in.
And then we get to the morning of October 23rd, 1983, which is a Sunday, which meant over in Beirut was a little different than the other days. The Marines were allowed to sleep in a little bit, which also tells us that Hezbollah had cased this, had learned, had been watching, and they planned it specifically for this time so that they knew the majority of the Marines would be asleep in their bunks in the headquarters and barracks building, about 350 of them sleeping in that building that morning. And take us through what happens as that truck speeds across the compound.
Absolutely. So just to kind of set the scene a little bit, how many of you guys have ever been in like an embassy suites? Yeah? You know, those hotels that have like the big atrium that's kind of hollowed out in the middle with the balconies that go all the way around it? That is what the BLT, the Battalion Landing Team headquarters, looked like. It had actually been the aviation headquarters in happier times for the Lebanese. And so it was basically a big office building that the Marines had taken over for their headquarters. And as the artillery and things like that increased, more and more of them moved inside so that they could have shelter and whatnot. And as Jack noted, you know, Sunday was a day of rest. They got an extra hour of sleep. They'd typically have hot dogs in the afternoon, maybe play a little bit of basketball or soccer outside where they'd kind of set up a field and whatnot. And of course, Hezbollah had paid attention to all of that. And so that morning, they load up a Mercedes truck with the equivalent of 12,000 pounds of TNT, so that much explosives. And they blow right through the security gate and penetrate all the way inside the atrium of that building. They make it about 13 feet inside that lobby when that bomb goes off. And of course, the time it took for them to enter the parking lot, blow through security, get inside that building, and that bomb to go off was just 10 seconds. And when that bomb went off, it was so powerful, and the roof on top of that building sort of was like a cork in a champagne bottle. So all of that pressure, as it's rushing up, sort of bounces back down from that roof. It literally blows the roof up and whatnot, but it also pushes that pressure back down and out all the doors and windows surrounding it. So some guys were actually sitting in front of their windows or in their bunks there, were blown out of the third floor of the building and literally to land on the ground below. Of course, the building, the detonation is catastrophic, as you can imagine. The entire building literally lifts up off of its foundation and then just collapses like a house of cards right back down on top of itself. The air is filled with concrete dust. Rocks are raining down for seconds. Even some of the guys would say even minutes later. So it's really just this pretty catastrophic scene. And Jack and I got to interview a lot of these guys, and we got to hear about their stories, and they're really, really powerful, what they went through. And I know you've got one or two that really affected you.
Yeah. I mean, it's also heartbreaking because you think about what the reasons that they were there, the situation they're put in by people in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. Also something that hasn't changed too much over the years. But the stories now that are amazing, because this is a very dark day for the Marine Corps. This is not raising the flag on Iwo Jima. This is a terrible day for the Marine Corps. But really, it also becomes a story of resilience and really hope. Because what happens in the aftermath of this explosion was one of the greatest rescue stories that you can imagine. Without the benefit of modern big trucks and cranes and all the rest of it, people who are blown off their feet, or to hear the explosion from across the compound there, run to the sound of that explosion, start digging through the rubble, and people inside the building who are awake, who were asleep 1 second, are now buried under tons of concrete. And there's one, Don Howell, who you can listen to the podcast and hear him talk about this in his own words. We did an interview with him on my Danger Close podcast. But there was an alert the night before, which meant that you had to go from wherever you were sleeping and go down in the basement because it was safer down there. And then the alarm would lift and they could go back to their bunks wherever they were sleeping in the building. and he decides to just stay down there. He got a good cot down there, so he had a good spot. He thought it would happen again. They'd just have to go back down and go to these cots in the basement again. And so that's where he is when the building comes down on top of him. And someone essentially that wasn't next to him a second ago is now there. And he says, where were you a second ago? And he says, I was sleeping on the 4th deck, and now he's in the basement. And it's complete pitch black, all this dust in the air. And he closes his eyes, says a prayer, opens his eyes, and there's a little shaft of light that wasn't there a second ago. And he starts digging through the rubble and digs himself out. Another guy on the way, right before the bomb goes off, he's walking across the compound, and he's like, he's supposed to go into the basement and start developing film. And he thinks, you know what, it's Sunday. Everybody else is sleeping. I'm gonna go get a cup of coffee. So he turns around to go get a cup of coffee, and that is what saves his life. And I know you've interviewed for your other books so many different people, and so many people with stories of being POWs, fighting in war, losing loved ones in combat. And I know there was one story that is different than than any other interview that you've ever done for a book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so many of these stories is just what Jack's related to you with Don Howe being stuck in the basement, and how a cup of coffee would save Randy's life, and how every day he makes his coffee in the morning, he's reminded that he's alive because of his addiction to caffeine. And, but, the story that just kills me, and you know him too, is Danny Wheeler. And Danny Wheeler was the chaplain. He's a Protestant chaplain. He's a Lutheran minister, a little bit older than most of the guys there. So he'd spent much of their time in Lebanon. He was 35 years old. Like a parent figured a lot of these 18, 19-year-olds, mentoring them through the homesickness and the fear and things of that nature, and just really a tremendous individual. He lived on the 4th floor of the BLT headquarters there. And when that bomb went off, he was asleep in his rack. He never heard it go off. He never felt himself falling. He just woke up buried, pinned in the dust and the debris, with no real idea of where he was. And what had happened is 2 walls had collapsed above him to create an A-frame that shielded him. His legs were still buried at this point. And on one of those walls had been right next to his bed. And every chaplain who'd been stationed there before him had written a blessing or a prayer on that. Maybe something from the Psalms, or a passage from the Bible. And so he called it the blessing wall. And here he was, pinned underground, up against that blessing wall. And imagine the scene. It's pitch black dark. It's really hard to breathe. Not only do you have all this dust and everything and the fumes from the bomb, but there's fires underground. And so he's under there, and he, an hour passes by, turns to 2, and he starts replaying the plots from these Louis L'Amour novels that his wife had sent to him, because, in all of Louis L'Amour's plots, there's always a cave-in of some mine somewhere, and some guy's got to resourcefully dig himself out or find another way. And so he starts replaying those, and 2 hours turns to 3 hours, and nobody comes for him. And finally, he starts to have this dark realization that maybe he's going to die there. He's got 3 kids, ages 7, 5, and 3. And as he sort of is in anguish at this point, he has this conversation with God. And he tells God, he's really angry at him. He says, did you really bring me here just to kill me? Is this the highest and best use for me? And so he has this argument underground with God. And finally, he hears God speak to him, and he says, everything's going to be all right. I've got this. And it's not long after that a hand comes down through the rubble and grabs his hand. And at that point, the guys start digging him out, and they get him out, and he is the last soul delivered alive from that wreckage after spending more than 5 hours underground. And I'll tell you, I get chills right now just from recounting that story. It's just, and I've interviewed atomic bomb survivors, atrocity victims, everything else, but Danny Wheeler's story it kills me every time, man. It's just so powerful.
Yeah, and those dentists that we talked about earlier, who Dr. John Hudson had trained up and had them move a little bit outside their comfort zones as dentists, learning about triage and mass casualty events, they end up having to essentially lead the rescue and recovery operations in the wake of the bombing. And let's talk about Dr. John Hudson. We talked about him earlier, and he did not make it through this bombing. And when Arnie Resnikoff goes to meet his widow, there's a conversation that they have that gave her a little bit of closure.
Yeah, so one of Dr. Hudson's good friends there had really insisted that when his remains were found, he wanted to be there to identify him. And so so a couple days later, as they're digging down layer by layer and removing all the debris, they find Dr. Hudson. And so his buddy comes up and he sees that he's as they sort of free him, he's got his hand on his head like that. And so they remove the hands that he's able to identify him. And so soon thereafter, he goes to see Lisa Hudson. And of course, a lot of families at this time, they're wrestling with a lot of doubts amid their grief. Was my husband really there? Maybe he's in one of the hospitals overseas. He's just being banged up. Nobody's recognized him or whatnot. And so she asks Jimmy, what did he look like? And he says, well, when he found him, his hand was like this. And she immediately gets up and leaves the room, and he's thinking to himself, oh my God, she's gonna have a breakdown. I've so offended her on this. I've gone too far. She comes back in with a photograph. It's a photograph of him sleeping with his hand like that. And she said, that's the way he slept. And so at that moment, she realizes that he didn't die suffocating underground, not, trapped for hours on hours. He died instantly, when the building came down. And it provided some comfort for her and her family. And as Jack noted, we spent a lot of time with Lisa and her son Will last week in Charleston. They were there for the book release. Will flew up from Atlanta to be with his mom. He was 9 months old when that happened. And we just earlier this week saw him again in Atlanta. And so it's just a reminder too, that how many lives are still affected by this. The ripples of this blast all these years later, it still echoes through so many people's lives.
Yeah, and I think this was the time to tell this story. All these years later, it really seemed to me that these guys were ready to tell it. In the aftermath of the event, a lot of these guys are still in the military. They stay in the Marine Corps for a while. Some do 30 years in the Marine Corps. So they couldn't really talk right afterward. That book you mentioned earlier, it's more of a current events book in 1984. But over the passage of all these years, it seemed like they were ready to tell their story. And to be trusted with that story was a huge responsibility for us, and such an honor and extremely humbling to tell these stories. Almost to a man, I would say that they felt the Marine Corps moved on very quickly in the aftermath of this event because it was such a dark day. And I think that really bonded them together. And I can't speak to what it was like at the 5 years after or 10 years after the event, but surely enough, 40 years after, when we went to the anniversary commemoration events last year, they were ready to talk. And actually, we had the first draft of the manuscript finished at this point, and we go to the event, and I'm the keynote speaker there, and we sit with Colonel Garrity and all his guys there. That was really cool, too. You could see that they would follow him anywhere still to this day. And he was a great example, actually, to them, because he's the one that's going to take responsibility for this. He's the one that's going to be essentially blamed for this. He's the one who's going to be held accountable for this as their commanding officer, and that's just how it goes in the military. He understood that. He was on a path. He was a recruiting poster Marine, and on the path to be the commandant of the Marine Corps. And this derails that, of course. And what does he do, though? He gets up, and he keeps moving forward. Shifts gears, moves into the intelligence field, goes to work at one of our intelligence agencies. But I think he was a great example for those guys in the aftermath, because a lot of them were still living in October 23rd, 1983. And then some you had to bring back there to tell the story of that day. They'd moved on, but you take them back there, and it's very difficult for them to go back in time there. But all of them, it seemed, looked to him as an example of someone who moved forward, which is something we don't really see today. I'll get to that in a minute about some parallels to today. So we got to do that, and with that draft done, though, so many people after that speech and at the end of that dinner came up to us and said, "We want to be interviewed too," type of a thing. I have a story here, and we got it, and so we really started scrambling and got a few.
We got extra letters, more diaries. I mean, at that point, we were just trying to shoehorn more stuff into that manuscript, and because we wanted to get as many voices in there as possible. I mean, even if it was like just one great quote that could go at the top of a chapter, or if it was one anecdote or whatnot. This isn't our story. This is theirs. And we wanted to make sure that we got as many voices and as many different viewpoints and perspectives and things like that in it. So this would be a book that these guys were proud of. And one thing I'll note, going back to Colonel Garrity, it was so powerful when he got out there to address these guys. There's 600 men all out there at the memorial there. And of course, as Jack noted, he was kind of the fall guy for this when it happened. But he got up there and he got to the microphone. One guy in the back yells, "I will follow you anywhere, sir." And I just, that just, tore me up.
Yeah, it was incredible to spend some time with these guys and get to know them and then get out of the way of the story. From our first phone call, like those were the exact words that you used. So we need to get out of the way of this story and let this be their story, which is the goal the whole time. And before we go to questions, a couple parallels to today. So in the aftermath of this event, there's a lot of tough talk out of the administration in Washington, and then we leave very quietly, or as quietly as one can leave, with a Marine Corps element of this size in early 1984. So the real lesson here weren't for us, they were really for the Iranians. And that lesson was that terrorism works. And more specifically, terrorism works through proxy forces, which that's the model that we talked about earlier, that paradigm that we've been operating under ever since, and Israel has to a lesser extent as well, and I would argue that it started to shift since about mid-July of this year, and we can get into that in questions if you'd like as well. But the real lessons learned are on the Iranian side of things in this case. But also parallels to today, we see Abbey Gate, August 2021. Once again, we have U.S. servicemen and women now at this point put in a tactically disadvantageous, once again, untenable position. Even worse because we had a tactically advantageous position at Bagram, and once again, they're put in this position by people in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. Once again, there's a bomb. Once again, American servicemen, and in this case now women, die. But there's another parallel also that is reassuring, gives me hope, and that's the servicemen and women who, in the aftermath of Abbey Gate, servicemen in the case of Beirut 1983, get up and run to the sound of those explosions, start trying to save as many of their brothers in arms, and in the case of Abbey Gate, brothers and sisters in arms as they possibly can. Also in the case of Abbey Gate, try to save as many innocent Afghans as they possibly can while still holding security, because in both cases, they didn't know if there was going to be a follow-on attack or multiple follow-on attacks. And so that's that same U.S. service member that was in Beirut, the same one that is there and at Abbey Gate, and the same one that's out there tonight, standing those posts. So there are a lot of parallels between what happened in 1983 and what we see today, both on the good and the bad side of things. But I think we're going to open it up for some questions. Is that right? I saw the sign somewhere.
Yeah, we're going to open it up to questions, but first, can we get a round of applause for these two gentlemen? I see some of you guys doing it right now. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll come to you with a mic. We only have 10 minutes. But the very first question comes from our live viewers on YouTube and X. And is there a specific...
It's good to know that this was streamed live. I'm glad I had that information earlier.
Is there a specific historical event that you find interesting or inspiring for your next writing? And it's open to any of you.
About the next book? That is classified.
Yeah. Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Got it. A question right over here.
Mr. Carr, Mr. Carr, thank you for being here with us. My name is David Mendoza. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My question is, given that we are on the eve of the October 7th attacks and the current geopolitical climate, as well as considering your experience and research, how do you think the U.S. can effectively address the evolving nature of terrorism that started with the events like the Beirut bombing?
Did you write that down ahead of time? So that, once again, it goes back to lessons in the pages of history. We had lessons before we went to Afghanistan from a Soviet experience from 79 to 89 that we failed to either learn from or we drew the wrong lessons. But we're not very good in this country of taking the lessons of the past and applying them going forward as wisdom. I think we can look to what the Israelis have done over the past couple months, starting about mid-July. They took a big hit, obviously, on October 7th. A tragic event, obviously, but also symbolically, when it pertains to their military and their intelligence services, they had an aura of, not invincibility about them, but they certainly were looked at as a juggernaut of military and intelligence as far as those apparatus goes. and they lost that on October 7th, so they've had to rebuild that, and they've taken some hits between October 7th and this past summer. But now we start to see things start to shift. Now we're seeing targeted strikes going after some of the people that were involved in this attack back in 1983. So taking some of those leaders off the board, and then things start to ramp up, and we have a pager and handheld communication device operation that'll be studied for decades, if not centuries, to come, using a modern convenience to sow terror into the hearts of their enemies. We see a very audacious special operations mission into Syria about 3 weeks ago, where there is a precision-guided missile facility underground that they could hit it with airstrikes, but they couldn't penetrate deep enough to destroy this thing. So they have to go in with special operations forces after softening it up with about 2 rounds of airstrikes. These guys go in, blow it up from the inside while using drones as a blocking force, meaning like we use Rangers for that to repel anyone responding to the special operators that are going inside. They use drones to do that in this case. And they grabbed a couple of Iranian scientists who were also on site. A treasure trove of intelligence also hit a Russian listening post in Syria. There's a relationship with Russia and Syria that goes back quite a ways, so they do that. And then they take out about half of Hezbollah's missile capability in Lebanon, just not that long ago, and then get Nasrallah, and now we see troops moving into southern Lebanon, and then we'll see where it goes from there. But they're shifting that paradigm that was set all those years ago. They're changing the rules that were set by Iran. So unless you want to see something repeated, you've got to change the rules, you've got to change the paradigm.
Next question right over here.
Mr. Carr, many people say that you're their hero, but who's your hero?
Oh, that is so kind. Gosh, it's gonna make me cry. Geez. So I'd say my hero is my grandfather, who didn't make it through World War II. So I only know him through photographs and through his medals, through pictures of him and his squadron. He flew the Corsair, which is the gull wing plane from World War II that folded up like that. Pappy Boynton flew that plane, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, a Marine, just like my grandfather. So I think the idea of him as my hero was extremely influential on my life. So I'd say it was my grandfather.
Next question over here.
Oh.
Thank you guys very much for being here today. My name is J.R. Nichols, and I'm the founder of the Traveling Memorial for 9/11 Iraq and Afghanistan. It goes, actually, curious enough, it goes from the bombing of the barracks in Beirut, Lebanon in '83 through current day. So what was it that triggered you to choose 1983 for this particular book, and what was it mentally that drove you to wanting to tell that story?
Well, that's what we talked about earlier, is that there wasn't really that book. If you'd asked me what book should I read to understand the seeds of terror in the Middle East today, there wasn't really that one. Or if you even more specifically asked me, hey, I heard about this bombing in April of 1983 that I think got our embassy, and then something about the Marine barracks in October. What book should I read to really understand that time period? There wasn't a book that I could have pointed you to, or a documentary, or a feature film. So there was that gap there. And just like for those who've been downrange, what you're looking for, and you can apply this to life as well, is adapting, looking for gaps in the enemy's defenses, and then capitalizing on momentum. So all the signs were there pointing like this story needs to be told. Such a pivotal moment in our relationship with the Middle East. And I remember it from being a kid. I remember the Time and Newsweek covers that I now have at home. And they were on our dining room table. Those were the 2 magazines we got in our house. And anything that had anything to do with military as a kid, I was reading even at a very young age. Anything that had to do with warfare, terrorism, insurgency, counterinsurgencies. Even at that young age, I knew I was going into the SEAL teams, and knew that somehow, even back then, that my generation's war would have some connection to terrorism. So all the signs pointed to October 1983.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and add one thing to that point too, which is, the passage of so much time allows us to look at this not as a current event, but as a historical event. And we can see that at that point, America's kind of on this fulcrum with our foreign policy. As the Cold War is winding down, in fact, it's going to wrap up in the next decade, American foreign policy is now going to shift increasingly more to the Middle East. And you're going to see it in the ramping up of terrorist attacks, the bombing of the Cole, the First World Trade Center, the Second World Trade Center. And of course, one of the fascinating things we discovered in looking at the congressional testimony in November of 1983 was when Marine Corps Commandant General P.X. Kelly was called to testify before Congress. A lot of the lawmakers kept asking him, what was the Marine security like and things like that? How could this happen or whatnot? And Kelly kept growing more and more frustrated. He said, you guys are looking at the forest, you're missing the forest for the trees. He says, this isn't one attack. This is a whole new form of warfare. And he says, what is it going to take for you guys to wake up and realize this? Is it going to be a suicide bomber and an airplane before we realize what we're up against? 18 years later, that's exactly it. So 1983, as Jack noted earlier, that is the balancing, the tipping point from where everything's going to change for America.
Next question, back right corner, right over here.
Right over here.
Hi, my name is Matt. Read your books, they're fantastic. So on the bombing the Cole, Mogadishu, Benghazi, Beirut, a lot of the shifting happening in our public opinion about when our soldiers are supposed to be placed in positions where they can be attacked, where they can be harmed and killed. And there seems to be a real strong, people don't want to do that. And political leaders are trying to decide, how to communicate to the country, vote for me because this is my approach. So Jack, since you've been a soldier and you've written about it, like what should be the standard by which a leader evaluates whether or not we should be placing soldiers in those vulnerable positions versus not doing that and using, other things to impose American foreign policy? What's the standard, the right standard in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't think it's a metric like that. It's more subjective than that, unfortunately. But really the metric is your understanding of the nature of the conflict about which you're about to commit U.S. forces, or if you inherit it, about which they're already committed. And that's one of the primary responsibilities of a commander-in-chief or an executive officer at a company. It's understanding the nature of the conflict in which you're engaged. We fail to do that time and time again. So these senior level leaders, and we saw it in this case as well. We saw this with infighting in the White House and not being able to understand where you're committing these guys and the consequences of that. So even more than understanding the nature, it's understanding that there are tactical level implications that go far beyond just that person who's going to be affected, that's 18, 19, 20-year-old kid who you're putting overseas somewhere. These are going to have multi-generational impacts to their families, whether they make it home or not. So when you make that decision to put U.S. boots on the ground somewhere around the world, that is a heavy decision, and you have to be absolutely certain that you're doing it for the right reasons and not putting them into these situations with one hand tied behind their backs, or in many cases, both hands tied behind their backs. So it's that understanding. We have a distinct lack of understanding, I think, in our U.S. foreign policy. So understanding also that the decisions made up here, they're going to filter all the way down through every level of that chain of command. And that final decision maker in that chain is an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid with a rifle, off safe, finger on the trigger, standing at a checkpoint, watching a vehicle approach, not knowing if it is laden with explosives or if it just has bad suspension. And that is the final decision maker in a chain of decision makers that starts with the President of the United States.
Before we jump into our last question right here in the back, straight ahead, don't forget to purchase your book, Targeted in Beirut. It is a great Christmas gift. We're selling them at the gift store. We have great service over there. Last question right here.
Awesome, thank you. With the benefit of hindsight, if you could go back and advise the White House on how to respond to this event, what sort of advice would you give?
Yes, we didn't really talk about the retaliation, which there was none. So there was no retaliation for this attack, and that's also something that almost every Marine brought up to us when we talked, is that that they felt whether it's vengeance or send a message, they felt that that lack of response is something that did not sit well for them, even all these years later. So with these troops on the ground, a response was necessary. And there were responses on the table, and we didn't do anything. Instead, we left. So it's not necessarily the response and the hit back, it's the lesson that Iran took from it. And so without sending that message, then they in turn set the rules that we're playing by today.
All right, let's get one last round of applause.
I'll say something. Thank you. I gotta say one more thing before we go.
Again, you can purchase the book Targeted in Beirut up at the gift store. They'll be up there to meet and greet you guys very quick, shake your hand, maybe take a quick picture. Have a great night.
But before we go, before we go. First, I want to thank everybody again for being here, for taking the time to be here with us tonight. Once again, it's sincerely appreciated. And right now, sun is going down here, which means it's coming up on another side of the world, and that sun's coming up on a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine who is 18, 19, 20 years old. And they're standing at that post right now, and they might be holding that rifle, like I just talked about, off safe, finger on the trigger, wondering what's in that vehicle that's approaching that checkpoint, put there by people at the highest levels of government who makes those decisions up there. So as the sun is coming up on them, I just want to keep them in our prayers and our thoughts. And with that, I want to thank you again for being here, and take care.
Yeah. All right. Awesome, buddy. Yeah, man.